Last puff.
And we're live.
Hi, everybody. Good night from Israel. It's 1 o'clock in the morning in Israel, and it's a late afternoon, in Montreal, where Rabbi Poupko is sitting in the office of his synagogue. This is the last event of JRoots before the virtual March of the Living that we'll be streaming as well, which the link will be up on our site. And it's an honor and a privilege to have Rabbi Poupko with us. I have traveled many times to Poland with Rabbi Poupko. It's been an inspiration every single time. And those of us, many of us who have worked in the education of the Holocaust have heard you speak in various different places, whether it be in Poland or other places around the world. And you've always managed to inspire us. And we felt that tonight, as our last event for the evening, before we have the virtual march, which you would have probably been speaking in Poland or somewhere else in Israel, wherever it may be, during this time, that you should maybe inspire us on spiritual resistance of people who went through the Holocaust. And I want to thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to jump off the call. I'm going to be back at the end of it. So I'm going to be listening here from my home in Israel. So thank you very much, Rabbi Poupko.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I can't tell you what an honor it is to collaborate in my own small way with Zvi Sperber, who is an extraordinary Jewish educator and whose passion only grows year after year, and he's been involved for many years now. And the impact he's had on young people of our generation is truly unparalleled, and not just young people, everyone. And Zvi deserves an enormous amount of credit for very creatively figuring out how to navigate education on a Yom Hashoah when we're all in varying degrees of isolation. And I want to again thank Zvi and JRoots for all that they did for today and all that they do all the time. I want to talk a little bit about spiritual resistance, but just as a prologue to the conversation about spiritual resistance, I want to talk about resistance in general, particularly as it relates to Yom HaShoah. You know, as you all know, or as everyone should know, in the years after the war, there was a debate in Israel about how to remember the Holocaust and when to remember the Holocaust, and what date on the calendar should be Holocaust Memorial Day. It was a fascinating and vigorous debate. There were those who advocated for the 10th day of Tevet. There were those who advocated for Tisha B'Av or the eve of Tisha B'Av. There were different ideas that were put forth. There were those who believed that it shouldn't have a distinctive day, but again, as I mentioned, it should be incorporated into Tisha B'Av based on one of the keynote that we say on Tisha B'Av in reference to the Crusades, where it says we don't add additional days of mourning to the Jewish calendar. And the date was chosen that generally falls in April, of course, the month of Nisan, and that always falls in the month of Nisan, generally in April. And the reason for the date, we know. The reason for the date was it was the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the reason the date of Yom HaShoah is on the anniversary of the start of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which that year fell April 19th, 1943, is that in many ways it was based on a misconception. And the misconception was, and can be encapsulated in an expression that's an obscene expression, katson lateva, that Jews went to their death like sheep to slaughter, an obscene lie that was promulgated after the war. There was a profound level of misunderstanding about the Holocaust in the years immediately following World War II. Profound misunderstanding. And it's interesting, the phrase katson lateva, like sheep to slaughter, was, according to historians, first articulated by Abba Kovner in the Vilna Ghetto. And Abba Kovner used that expression not as a criticism of the Jewish people, not as a condemnation, but it was used to inspire people to revolt, which is what actually happened. We shouldn't go katson lateva, like sheep to slaughter. Abba Kovner, an unbelievable writer and a fighter and an extraordinary personality who later lived in Israel and fought for Israel. And that's how he said those words. And it was never intended as a criticism, because in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. And the reason the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was chosen as the date for Yom HaShoah is because in the early years of Israel, there was the other misconception, which was that not only did the new state represent a new political condition for the Jewish people, it also represented the attempt to create a new kind of Jew, not the obsequious, weak Jew of exile, but the strong, courageous Jew of the new Zionist state, of the state of Israel, and that Jews needed to be, in a sense, reborn in a way that, again, that looked very negatively at the exile in general, and particularly at the behavior of Jews during the Holocaust. There was this idea that the Jews didn't fight. There was the idea that Jews didn't resist, and therefore Yom HaShoah lands on Warsaw Ghetto Uprising anniversary. You say, oh, the anomaly should be what we remember. It is those fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that we want to associate with. They are the ones who deserve prominence in our memory, which is why Yom HaShoah is technically known as Yom HaShoah V'Gvura, the Holocaust day, and the day of strength and resistance. And so it was the idea that this Warsaw Ghetto was almost a singular moment in the years of the Holocaust, and that it was again predicated on the false assumption that resistance was rare, and that in general Jews, in fact, were complicit even in their own deaths by going like sheep to slaughter. It's interesting. Yehuda Bauer, the great Holocaust historian, who lectured often in Israel about the Holocaust, he wrote something about this accusation that bears repeating. He wrote, "This is the major question arising in every discussion on the Shoah, in every unit of soldiers, every school class and university seminar. It is distilled in the expression like sheep to slaughter." And then he says, this phrase is interesting because it's unique in reference to the Jews. He goes on to speak about how there were over 1 million Soviet prisoners of war, for instance, who were murdered in camps by the Germans. And yet there's not a single moment of resistance recorded about Soviet POWs. Not civilians, not old people, not children, not women, soldiers. And there's not a single record of their resistance. And yet no one ever asked the question about them. And he goes on to say, he says, this question is uniquely Jewish. It seems to be an expression of self-hate, of a demand from ourselves to be superhuman, heroic, completely supernatural. The fact that this question is asked at all regarding the Jews, and that it is asked passionately, and sometimes with hostility, demands a response. And listen to how he understands the accusation, because it's so relevant for our time. Apparently, the answer is found in the uniqueness of our particularly self-destructive and self-critical attitude towards ourselves as Jews, although we are forgiving towards others. And so what changes? How did our understanding of the Holocaust change? How did the understanding in Israel change so dramatically? Where you don't hear that accusation anymore, that false accusation anymore, that false description of Katzon L'Tevach, like sheep to slaughter. And what happened was the following, in the years after the war, and I'm not sure people really understand this, Holocaust survivors were almost made to feel ashamed for what they had gone through because of sentiments like this. And they were given the very clear message that people weren't interested in what they had to say. Early Holocaust diaries and books were ignored. And something changes dramatically. In the early 60s, after the successful capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina by Israel, and afterwards being brought to justice and trial in Jerusalem, for the first time, survivors' voices were heard. In those years, TVs were rare in Israel. People listened to the trial on radio. And for days and weeks, testimony was for the first time heard from the voices of survivors themselves. And Israelis in the world, world jury, began to understand how little they understood about what had happened during those years. And for the first time, survivors were allowed to speak. And for the first time, survivors were heard. And for the first time, people began to realize how obscene were some of their misunderstandings about what had occurred. And that, in fact, the Warsaw Ghetto was not a singular moment. It was it was more accurately would be described as the rule, not the exception. We began to learn about the rebellions, not only in the Warsaw Ghetto, but in Vilna, and Kovna, Brücke, and Krakow, the revolts in the camps, Treblinka and Sobibor, the revolt at Birkenau, and we began to learn more and more about the resistance. And I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the most famous act of resistance, and then move to what is the core subject of this discussion, which is spiritual resistance. You know, in order to understand, just the timeline of events, at the beginning of 1942, a year and a half or so after the Nazi invasion of Poland, at the beginning of World War II, 80% of the Jews who were going to be killed in the Holocaust were still alive. By the end of 1943, 80% of the Jews who were going to be killed in the Holocaust were already dead. The mass killing takes place from the middle of 42 on through the summer and early fall of 43. That's when the mass killing takes place during Operation Reinhardt, during the construction of the 3 death camps in East Poland, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. Treblinka, we lose about 800,000 of our people. Belzec, about 650,000. Sobibor, 250 to 300,000. And that was after already what had occurred in occupied Russia with the Holocaust by bullets, with the mass slaughter of Jews standing around pits, and which has been remarkably and tragically documented today in a way which we really didn't understand even 10 and 20 years ago, because the efforts of wonderful people, a Catholic priest in France who has made it his life's work to uncover the addresses of those pits, the famous ones like Babi Yar and Kia near Kiev, and Ponar outside of Vilna, and Rumbala outside of Riga, and in forests too numerous to mention, all over eastern Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, and in Ukraine. And it was the deportations to Treblinka begin in 1942 and continued to 1943. And it was in April of 1943 that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising begins. And it's hard for any of us, the ghetto was sealed in October of 1940. And the Jews who engaged in the uprising had been in the ghetto since that time. They had lived under conditions that none of us could ever imagine, of disease and random shootings and of mass deportations and of absolute hunger, and a degree of hunger that, again, none of us can ever imagine, and that no one who endured it can ever forget. If you want to read a description of the hunger of the ghettos, read Yeshaya Spiegel, who wrote about it after his experiences in the Lodz Ghetto. There are those who believe, and again, it's hard to know with absolute accuracy, that the average calorie intake in the Warsaw Ghetto was a little less than 200 calories a day, day after day, week after week, month after month. And it was a group of young people who led the revolt after having endured all of that suffering. And I just want to read to you two or three brief descriptions of the revolt. Descriptions not written by Jews, but written by Jürgen Stroop, the SS commander who was in charge of the operation in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he wrote home. He wrote back. There was teletype messages every day from Warsaw back to military headquarters in Germany. And he writes the following. And these are his words. These are the words of a Nazi. Sealing of the ghetto at 0300 hours. At 0600 hours, the Waffen-SS was sent into action to sweep the remnant ghetto. Waffen-SS strength was at 16 officers and 850 men. Immediately after the units assembled, a heavy and organized surprise attack by the Jews began. The tank assigned to this operation and both heavy armored cars were pelted with Molotov cocktails. The tank was set on fire twice. During the surprise attack, our units were directed to engage the enemies. Our losses in the first attack were 12 men. And he goes on to describe the vigorous assault. And from a couple of days later, that was from the opening day, he writes the following, that during the armed resistance, women belonging to the fighting units were armed in the same way as the men. Some were members of the Hashoah movement. It was not rare for these women to fire pistols with both hands. It happened again and again that they kept pistols and hand grenades hidden in their bloomers until the last moment in order to use them against the men of the Waffen-SS. The resistance offered by the Jews, and again, I remind you, these are words written by Jürgen Stroop, the Nazi commander. The resistance offered by the Jews and the bandits could be broken only by the energetic, tireless deployment of storm patrols day and night. And then he writes how they went ahead and they started burning down the buildings. And when the fire became too intense, Jews would go to the upper floors, throw mattresses down to the street, then leap onto the mattress, and crawl with broken bones to find another bunker across the street in which to hide. And again, there's remarkable stories of fighting. And I'll end with a discussion of the Warsaw Ghetto with a description written by Tzivia Lubetkin, the survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto. By the way, after the war, Tzivia Lubetkin and Yitzhak Zuckerman married. And it's important to remember these fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto, their granddaughter was the first female Air Force pilot in Israel's Air Force. This is how she wrote about the opening moments of the uprising. All of a sudden, they started entering the ghetto, thousands armed as if they were going to the front against Russia. And we, some 20 men and women, young in their small unit, what were our weapons? The arms we had a revolver, a grenade. The whole group had 2 guns and some bombs. We had to light it by matches and Molotov bottles. It was strange to see those 20 men and women, Jewish men and women, standing up against the armed great enemy, glad and merry, because we knew that their end would come. We knew that they will conquer us first, but to know that they would pay a high price for our lives. When the Germans came up to our posts and marched by, we threw those hand grenades and bombs and saw German blood pouring over the streets of Warsaw. After we had seen so much Jewish blood, there was rejoicing. The tomorrow didn't worry us. The rejoicing amongst Jewish fighters was great. And see the wonder and the miracle, she writes. Those German heroes retreated, afraid and terrorized from the Jewish bombs. You know, the acts of resistance, again, some of which I mentioned earlier, were by no means an exception. One of the most well-known stories is also the revolt at Birkenau. You know, the revolt at Birkenau was led by women who smuggled gunpowder, body cavities from a satellite camp where there was an arms factory. And they started the munitions factory at Weichel Union Metalwork. It was a satellite camp of the Auschwitz complex. Women whose names we should know: Esther Waxblum, Ella Gartner, Regina Safferstein, smuggled the gunpowder for a woman named Rosa Rabota. Anyway, it's a very long story. I just want to tell you one small part of the story. These heroic women blow up crematorium number 4. When you visit Birkenau today, you still see the remains of crematorium number 4, which they blew up in the revolt at Birkenau. And the revolt included not just the blowing up of the crematorium, but also physical assaults on the Nazi guards by the Sonderkommando. Anyway, the women were caught, obviously, and they were tortured for days to give up their names of the collaborators. These poor young Jewish women were tortured mercilessly for days. Not one of them broke. Not one of them gave up a name of a collaborator. Not one of them gave any information. And ultimately they were hung. And at their hanging, one of them yelled out, we don't know which one, yelled the word Nikum, vengeance. That itself is an act not only of physical resistance, but of spiritual resistance, of speaking up for Jewish dignity and Jewish pride at the worst possible moment. There was another story of spiritual resistance that was mildly publicized the past week because of the death due to corona of a Holocaust survivor named Meir Braun in New York. He was a Maidanic survivor. He died in his 90s from corona, from COVID-19. He is a survivor of Maidanic. Throughout all his years during the war, he never missed a day putting on tefillin. Every day he would go out, he had a pair of tefillin hidden in a tree in the camp. He'd go out furtively for a few moments to put on tefillin and put them back, and he put them on every day of his life till the day he left this world. And the name of Meir Braun should be remembered, particularly this week, the week of his Shiva. Spiritual resistance. Spiritual resistance means a lot of things. Spiritual resistance means Jews maintaining Jewish faith, Jewish practice during the worst moments. Spiritual resistance means living a life of Jewish dignity and Jewish honor under the worst possible circumstances. Jewish dignity means living a life in the camps and in the ghettos, where one asserts Jewish honor, in extreme conditions. I heard this story, the following story I heard about 35 years ago. The person who told it was around 40 years old. He was telling the story of the death of his father in a shtetl in Poland in the opening months of the war in the end of 39. At the time the story took place, the person who told me the story was 9 years old. He told me the story again, as I said, when he was about 40. He was telling about the death of his own father. The Nazis acted with remarkable consistency and regularity. Whenever they went into a shtetl, one of the first things they would do is they would round up the Jewish citizens in the town square, and they would take the Jewish leadership, sometimes murder, sometimes assault, and humiliate. They would take the leadership of the community as they understood it. His father was one of the leaders of the community. So picture a town square, hundreds of Jews standing around. In the middle of the square is a Jew with a Nazi. The Nazi takes out his gun, points it to the Jew. And again, the person telling me this story was the son of the man. Points the gun at a Jew and says to the Jew, "Jew, lick my boots." And he refused. He said instead, "Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad." He said the Shema. Hero is the Lord our God, the Lord is one, a testimony of faith. And the Nazi took out his gun and shot the Jew in the leg, and then he fell to the ground. And again, he's put the gun to the Jew. And he said to the Jew, "Now lick my boots." And again, the Jew said, "Shema." And he shot him in the other leg. And again, he said, "Jew, lick my boots." And again, the Jew said, "Shema." Took the gun, put it in his left arm, said the same thing. And the Jew said, "Shema." His right arm, he again said, "Shema," instead of licking the boot. Finally, now for the fifth and final time, he put the gun to the Jew's head and he said, "Jew, lick my boots." And again, he said, "Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad," and the Nazi shot him in the head. And the person who told me this story, again, the son of the victim, decades after the war, said, this story is not unusual. Jews died saying Shema. We have a lot of stories of Nazis who knew Shema by heart because they heard it so often. He says, what's unusual about my father's story, however, is that was the first time I ever heard my father say the Shema. My father was an atheist. My father didn't believe. My father never took me to synagogue. He never said Shema with me at night. I had never heard my father say the Shema before. It was the only time he ever said it. Now, what does that story mean? I guess some would tell you, well, at the last moment, he embraced faith. I don't believe that's the explanation of the story. You understand the Jew of that time, you understand why he said those words. He understood that if you're going to be murdered for being a Jew, you die like a Jew. And whether you believe the sentiment encapsulated in that sentence or not, really isn't relevant. You say the Shema because you're being killed as a Jew. And you say the Shema to tell the Nazi, to tell anyone listening, to tell yourself that although the Nazi may be successful in killing you, he won't kill what we believe in. The Nazi can't kill our faith. The Nazi can't kill our ideals. The Nazi can't kill our ethics. That which we value most cannot be touched. That which we value most, that which is most sacred to us, can't be seen. It can never be destroyed. And when the Jew said Shema, even though he was an atheist, that was the message that we will live on and that our ideas will live on. And as many synagogues as they burn, as many Torah schools as they burn, as many Jews as they murder, that's the Jewish people will always be here. Will always be here. Because you can't kill the source of our strength. The source of our strength are our ideas and our faith. And because of that, ultimately we'll always be here. And that's why he said the Shema, even though he didn't believe. When you talk about spiritual resistance, long time ago, Zvi Sperber and I led the first Jewish group that went to Yad Vavna after the book Neighbors was published, written by Jan Gross. It was a source of enormous controversy till today in Poland because of the city Yad Vavna, not far from Bialystok. The city of Yadvabna, due to Jan Gross's research, became known that it was not the Nazis who killed the Jews in Yadvabna, but in fact it was the Poles who had killed the Jews in Yadvabna. And the book was written. The book was called Neighbors. If you haven't read it, you should read it. And it was called Neighbors because Jews and Poles had lived together for hundreds of years in Yadvabna. And one day they turned on the Jews, herded them into a barn, and doused the barn with gasoline and lit them on fire. The names of the dead we know. And when Svi and I were there, we read the name of every victim of Yadvabna, hundreds of names of the victims in Yadvabna. And in that book, and again, this is not Jewish testimony, this is Polish testimony. During that time, again, they're herding the Jews into a burning, they herd them into a barn, they lit it on fire, then they pushed more Jews in. There was a Jew there named Michal Krupatova. And Michal Krupatova was in line, about to be pushed into the barn, when somebody he knew pulled him out of line. A Polish Catholic pulled him out of line because he had fought in the Polish army, pulls him out of line. This is a remarkable moment of resistance, of spiritual resistance. Michal pulls away from the Pole. He looks him in the eye and he says, I go where my people go. And he walked into the barn. Whether it was because he didn't want to be saved by a murderer or whatever reason, just absolute identification with his people in life and in death. He said, I go where my people go. He walked into the barn, an act of Jewish resistance. Yes, that's resistance. You know, some of the most remarkable acts of spiritual resistance, and that again leaves us overwhelmed with the acts of resistance, even by young people, by children. It's a remarkable story. You know, everyone knows what the Sonder Commando was. Sonder Commando of Birkenau worked for 4 months. They themselves were killed. We have very few testimony from Sonder Commando survivors, but at least two that I'm aware of wrote books after the war. One was Shlomo Venezia, and one was Philip Mueller. Philip Mueller's book is called Eyewitness to Auschwitz. He tells a story there, which tells you something about the Jewish character. He tells the story of the tragedy of the family camp. When he wrote about the family camp, what he was referring to was a group of Jews who had been brought together as a group from Theresienstadt to Birkenau. It was a remarkably unique story. The reason they were kept together was because the Red Cross had visited them in Theresienstadt, and they had made a commitment to the Nazis that they could be visited again in 4 months. It's a very long and very painful story. But because they had lived in Birkenau, when they were taken to their death, they knew exactly what was going to happen to them, unlike most who were brought and immediately killed. And he tells the story one day where he, as a Sonder Commando, he ushered and herded a group of young Jewish girls, teenage girls, into the gas chamber. And they all knew what was going to happen. They were all about to be killed. And they're all going to be gassed. And Philip Mueller he gives up on everything at that point. And he writes this in his book, a remarkable passage. He talks about how he decided to die. And he decided to die along with these teenage girls, and he stays with them in the gas chamber. And they look at him, and they realize what he's doing. He's willfully putting an end to his own life. He can't continue to do what he's been forced to do. And the girls together, without any coordination, begin to push him out. And they all say to the same thing. You have to live. You have to try to live, because someone has to tell our story. Someone has to live to tell our story. Imagine the last thoughts of a teenage Jewish girl standing in a gas chamber in Birkenau, knowing that all of their dreams were finished, their lives were over. Everybody they ever cared about in the world was going to be killed at that moment. Anyone who would ever loved them is now gone. And the last thought in their mind was Jewish history, the sanctity of Jewish history, that Philip Mueller, the Sonder Commando, had to try to live to tell their story. And they push him out. The Nazis see what has happened. They realize he had tried to kill himself. They beat him to within an inch of his life, yelling at him, Jew dog, you die when we tell you to, not a moment earlier. And miraculously, he escapes and it survives. That tells you about the instinct for memory, the powerful instinct for memory, how we have to tell those stories over and over again. We learned this 3,300 years ago in our first Pesach. We got it to Levincha. What happens to the Jewish people is sacred and it can't be forgotten. And we have an obligation to tell those stories. We invented, according to many, the whole idea of history and of memory, of imparting the stories and devising the mechanism for memory. And thank God Philip Mueller lived to tell that story and to write that story. You know, you talk about resistance. Leon Thorne was a Jew from Lemberg who survives the war and actually became a rabbi in Brooklyn after the war. He wrote a small book, again, in the years after the war. And he tells the following story. One day, a young group of young men, including himself, were taken out of the ghetto. And they were all handed sledgehammers because they were going to, they were ordered to knock down, destroy the matzevot, the tombstones in the Jewish cemetery. You know how often this happened. I don't have to tell you. I have a book right here at my desk called Matzevot, written in a Polish book that has photographs of Matzevot paving streets and sidewalks as the foundation for barns, what they did to our Matzevot, what they did to our tombstones. You all know the stories. Anyway, he tells a fascinating story, though. He picks up a sledgehammer to break the tombstone, and he pauses for a moment. He reads the name on the tombstone. He asks Mechila. He asks forgiveness using the name inscribed, engraved on the tombstone, and he says a Kalmali Rachamim, says a memorial prayer, and then he breaks the tombstone. And he looks around the cemetery, and he sees all the other Jewish guys who had the sledgehammers in their hands, forced to break the tombstones, all doing the same thing, all asking forgiveness and all saying Kalmali without coordination. To be a Jew of honor is to feel solidarity, not just with the living, but with the dead. We have a commitment, a covenant with the Jewish dead to honor them and to protect even them. And they all knew what to do. That's spiritual resistance. That's acting like a Jew the worst possible moment. To remember our obligations to every Jew everywhere. And they all asked Mechila, and they all said the Kalmali. One of the earliest books of the Holocaust was written by a woman named Lena Berg from Warsaw. And she describes the death of a group of young women in Auschwitz. She writes the following. They were from Salonika, and I tell this story because we need to always remember the scope of the destruction. And we focus on Poland and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, Russia, and we have to remember France, and we have to remember Greece, and remember North Africa. We have to remember all of the places, Northern Europe. And she writes about a group of young women from Salonika, an old Jewish community, a beautiful Jewish community that was completely destroyed. She writes they had been brought to Auschwitz only weeks before, slender, black-eyed against the sleet and cold of the northern October. They sang a sentimental song called Mama, whose melody made one weep. And then she writes, their fiery eyes had become dull and sunken sockets, empty and dead, emaciated, dirty, repulsive. Those Greek women could barely drag themselves around. Once so beautiful, they now had legs like sticks and their breasts hung like bags. Their complexion, made velvet smooth by the southern sun, were now covered with horrible abscesses, vermin bites, and the marks of scabies incessantly scratched. They stank of gangrene, dysentery, unwashed sweat, and wretchedness. When they went to their death, they sang Hatikva, that song of undying hope, the song of an old people, which has always carried the vision of Zion in its heart. Since then, Lena Berg writes, every time I hear Hatikva, I always see them, the dregs of human misery. And I know that through the Jewish people flows a stream of eternity, greater and more powerful than any individual deaths. One of the most painful and moving stories comes to us from Bergen-Belsen. It's tell you the story just a week after Pesach. In Bergen-Belsen, I mean, the Jew is remarkable. We're remarkable people. Pesach, the holiday of freedom. What slave celebrates freedom? Jewish slaves celebrate freedom. The Jews in Bergen-Belsen, they came back from a hard day in the quarry. They came back and So somebody remembered it was Pesach. And one of them wrote a prayer, which they all said. And they wrote it in Hebrew. One guy wrote it in Hebrew. It's called Tfilah al Achilat Chametz B'Pesach. Celebrating freedom in a place of slavery. He writes a prayer called the prayer on eating bread on Passover. I'll read you the English. Our Father in heaven, it's revealed and known to you that it's our wish to fulfill your wish to celebrate Pesach by eating matzah and refraining from eating chametz. But our heart is pining because the enslavement prevents us. We are ready and prepared to fulfill your commandment, and you shall live by them. Therefore, we pray to you and keep us alive, preserve us, so that we can observe thy statute. And let it be that the eating of bread should be like before you, like the eating of matzah. A group of young Jews, abandoned by God and man, celebrating freedom in a place of slavery, feeling compelled to acknowledge it by writing a prayer about the necessity to eat bread on Passover to survive. That's spiritual resistance. That's the refusal to do anything but to be Jewish, even then and even there. Tell you two more things before we conclude. One of the most horrific addresses of the war was in Lithuania and Kovna. Many of you have heard of Rabbi Oshry, who wrote 6 volumes or so, Shaila Chuvot Minamakim, responsive from the depths. And Rabbi Oshry lived and survived the war, and he wrote down responsive and the stories that he had encountered in the war, and horrific stories. And he was a rabbi in Montreal, actually, for a year before moving to New York. And one of the things he tells is about a story about a young boy. Again, this tells you about who we are as a people. 12-year-old kid comes over to him one night. And because there was an action planned the next morning, they were taking the kids away to be killed. And he knew he was going to die the next day. He says to Rabbi Oshry, he says, you and I both know I'm not going to survive. You and I both know I'm not going to live to my bar mitzvah. I'm 12 years old. I'm never going to be bar mitzvah. Rabbi, he said to Rabbi Oshry, do I have your permission to put on tefillin, even though I'm too young? Because I don't want to leave this world without ever having worn tefillin. And of course, Rabbi Oshry said yes, and he put on tefillin. To understand our people is to understand ourselves. To hear these stories is not to hear the stories about other people, but these are our stories. This defines who we are. This is what we are made of. This is our collective consciousness. This is our DNA. These aren't the stories of strangers. These aren't even the stories of other people. These are our stories. These stories define us. These stories have shaped us. These stories remind us of what we live for. After the war, Jews find themselves in displaced persons camps, as we know. And the story is told about the first Yom Kippur after the war. There are many stories about Rabbi Yukatil Halberstam and Kloisenberger Rebbe in his survival during the war. But I'm going to tell you a story about the Kloisenberger Rebbe that takes place after the war. He's standing up on Yom Kippur to speak before Yizkor. And he's wearing a kittel. The white garment we wear in synagogue on Yom Kippur. By the way, it's a funny thing. If you would walk in today, in the year 2020, to a hospital in Poland, and go over to a doctor and ask him, what do you call that white coat you wear? You know what he answers? He says, kittel. That's how intertwined Jews were in Polish culture. That's the word they used to describe a white robe till today. We were there for so many centuries. Anyway, so Rabbi, the Kloisenberger Rebbe is in DP camp. He's wearing a kittel. He gets up to speak. He had lost his whole family. Lost everything in the war. And he stands up in front of a group of people who, like him, had lost everything. What do you say to Jews on Yom Kippur, the first Yom Kippur, after the Holocaust? I'll read you his words. He spoke them in Yiddish. I'll read them to you in English. He said, one of the reasons we wear this kittel is because it is the traditional burial garment in which you wrap a body before laying it to rest in the ground, as we do when we bury our parents and those that come before us. Wearing a kittel on Yom Kippur reminds us of our final day of judgment, when we will be laid to rest, and therefore humbles us and stirs us to do tshuva, to repent. The white linen kittel is a symbol of purity that we achieve through our introspection. Since the kittel, he went on, this is what the Rebbe said, the Klosenberger Rebbe, he said, since the kittel reminds us of the burial shroud of those that passed on before us, why are we wearing a kittel today? Our parents and loved ones were just slaughtered and without tachlichim, without a kittel. They were not buried according to Jewish practice. They were buried with or without clothes in mass graves or in no graves at all. And suddenly, he did something shocking. He took off his own kittel. He ripped it off. And he threw it to the ground. He threw the kittel down. And he yelled, "No more kittel. Let us be like our parents. Let us remove our kittels so that they can recognize us. They never wore a kittel. If they see us, they won't recognize us." And he ripped off his kittel. What does he mean with this story? Story, visceral story of pain, a visceral story of loss. And the story means is really very simple. We have to lead lives that our parents and our grandparents would recognize. We want them to recognize. That's all any Jew should ever want out of his life. That when we sit in our house at our Seder, or we stand up to them, whatever it is that we do, we would want our parents and our grandparents to say, "I recognize. That's what I did. That's exactly the words I spoke. That's the Seder I ran." That's all we want. And the way we get there, the way we lead lives that they would recognize, is by remembering them. Not just remembering how they were murdered, but by remembering how they lived. One of the great things about Tzvi, it's really founded on a Pirkei Rebbe Lezer. The Pirkei Rebbe Lezer has asked a question. It says, one pasuk says, the Pirkei Rebbe Lezer asked us as a contradiction. Fascinating Pirkei Rebbe Lezer. One pasuk says, "Zochar Yom Shabbos l'kadsho." One pasuk says, "Remember Shabbos." One pasuk says, "Zochar Yisrael Shalach Amalek." One pasuk says, "Remember Amalek." How is it possible to do both? It's an unbelievable question. How are you, if you're going to remember Amalek, how are you going to have room in your soul to remember Shabbos? If you're going to remember Shabbos, how could you possibly remember Amalek? They ask us a contradiction. And the question answers itself. You have to do both. There are some who only remember the Holocaust and don't remember how the Jews lived and what they lived for and what their lives looked like. To reduce the 6 million to how they died is a terrible insult. There were much more than how they died. It's how they lived. We have to remember the Shabbos, and we have to remember Amalek. We have to remember what the enemy did, yes. More importantly, we have to remember how our people lived before the war and how they lived during the war. The acts of everyday spiritual resistance, of every day maintaining Jewish dignity and Jewish honor and Jewish faith. That's what we have to remember, is how they lived, to remember their Shabbos and to remember Amalek at the same time. I'm going to hand things back to Tzvi, and again, thank JRoots and Tzvi Sperber for all that they do all the time.
Hi, Rabbi Poupko, incredible. I saw you standing there on the mound in Miller 18 giving part of your speech. Saw you in Israel saying it's really incredible to listen to you as usual. The end of Yom Hashoah proceedings that we're putting together, that we've been going since 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time yesterday. I think I want to just mention a couple of things, if you allow me. Number one is we always look towards the future, and we always look towards hope. One of the most profound experiences that I have ever had took place in Auschwitz with me. I was with a group. I'm standing there towards evening at the crematoria, the bombed out crematoria number 2 that we've stood together many times. And as I stand there at crematoria number 2, I'm speaking to the group facing the crematoria. And the lights were on, the spotlights were on. And all of a sudden, as our group was standing there, their shadows were standing in the changing rooms of the crematoria, talking about no difference between us and them, the Jewish people themselves. But then I witnessed something that I'll never ever forget. As I watched a fox run through the ruins of the crematoria. And all I could think about was Rabbi Akiva. All I could think about was Rabbi Akiva standing there on the hills over Yerushalayim from Har Tzofim, laughing as he saw the fox traveling through the ruins of Yerushalayim. Akiva, Akiva nichamtani. Rabbi Akiva, you have comforted us. As he witnessed and saw the concept of the fact that the Jewish people once again arise. They will rebuild Jerusalem. They will rebuild their people. We stand here now at the edge of the end of Yom HaShoah, walking into the week, this solemn week, which we've stood together many times in front of Yeshua Friedberg's grave at Har Herzl, and all the other Chayalim who sacrificed their life for us to be able to have the state of Israel as well. And today, an incredible, incredible video came out, which allows us to connect the two. And maybe I want to end off with showing us this. If you don't mind, I'm just going to share the screen of our soldiers who have been packing food to help all the people who have had coronavirus, all the elderly who need it, all the Nitzolei Shoah, the Holocaust survivors who have needed food. And before they went out, about 7 hours ago, this is what they did. I'll just try and get it. Oh, sorry, let me go back. No, that's wrong. Let me try again. Oh, let's go back. Here we go. Takes us back to those moments that we've had together, but those moments of Ani Mami Be'emunah Shalema, that we believe in a complete faith, in a new world, a new idea, and the Jewish people rising again out of the ashes. We have done that on the backs and holding on to the coattails of our survivors. I have to at this moment say thank you to you, Rabbi Poupko, for ending off our proceedings together. And all of the back team, I want to thank Jay. I know that most of you don't know him, but he's worked tirelessly to make sure this has been up. And everybody else that's been involved in our day of, well, more than a day, 25 hours now of JRoots, that we've really tried to be able to bring you the best content as possible. God willing, all of us will be able to be meeting again in Yerushalayim very, very soon in person. And may we never, ever, ever take these words of never forget lightly. Don't just say them, do something with it. Build the Jewish people. Build what it means to be a Jew. And I thank you once again. Shalom from Bet Shemesh and from Israel to all of you.